It's my pleasure to introduce to you one of the best voices I've ever heard, Charlie Tuna. And Charlie, it's great to have you here.
I suddenly feel very old after all that.
Oh, now you're not old. What are you talking about? You sound as young as you did when you first came here in the 60s. How'd you come up with that name, Charlie Tuna?
It goes back to a guy who was a newsman in Oklahoma City. He's now one of the top voiceover guys here in town, Chuck Riley. And he's done like ABC Eyewitness News at 11. That's Chuck's voice you've heard. And on the Ford spots, everything. But Chuck was a newsman. And just before I got down there at KOMA in Oklahoma City to start my new job, my new career, everybody on the staff got sick, except for Chuck. He was a newsman, though, and he wasn't wanting any part of being on the air as a personality. Well, as it turned out, they said, you've got to do it. This weekend we have no jocks. Everybody's sick. He said, well, I'm not going to demean my journalistic integrity being a disc jockey. He said, well, choose another name then. So legend has it, night before, he was watching television. On came the Starkiss commercial. By that time, he had about a six-pack of Coors in him. He decides he's going to be Charlie Tuna. Went on the air the next day on a Sunday and played it straight, just like I've always done with the name, Charlie Tuna. I got down there the next weekend. I'm a kid out of Nebraska, basically, 20 years old, my dream station. They said, you got to be the permanent Charlie Tuna. I said, no. Well, I had no choice. I wanted to work there, and that was the beginning of Charlie Tuna.
How about that? Now, Charlie, one thing that you and I do have in common is that we come from the great state of Nebraska. I grew up in Omaha. You grew up in Kearney. Mm-hmm. Talk about your days growing up in the Cornhusker State.
I loved it because it gives you the Midwest background. It gives you the appreciation, the friendly people around you all the time. I think it gives you accessibility. It's one of the great places. Charles Champlin, who was a writer for the LA Times back in the 70s, told me that he was a correspondent for Time magazine before he joined the Times. He would always go between Omaha and Denver. Those were his commutes. And right in the middle of that commute was Kearney. And he stopped one day, saw Harmon Park, and just loved it. He said, your city was just one of the best I've ever been in. I loved the park. And that was really the friendly part. That we were named, as a matter of fact, Kearney, the friendly city. And I grew up in that atmosphere. I think it made me what I am today. A lot of people have commented. They say, well, you just seem like one of us. You just seem very warm and friendly. Well, it goes back to Nebraska.
How about that? Now, they've got that archway at Kearney. I've actually never seen that. Have you seen that?
I saw that one of the last times I've never been in it, but yeah, that's a recent addition to Nebraska folklore back there.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, I had heard somewhere you first went on the radio in Kearney at age 15?
16, just turned 16. I was in high school as a sophomore, and I had been after a job in radio because my hero, Jack Lewis, God rest his soul, he was the morning man when I was 5 years old, inspired me to be a disc jockey. He was the guy who in the morning said he had a monitor, he could see all the boys and girls dressing, so he had a dressing race every morning. He was the one who told me when the snow had closed the school for the day. He was one of the first to talk about UFOs, flying saucers as they called them in those days, and he had some great stories. And I just thought this guy had the best job in the world. Even at 5 years old, I was inspired by him. So I started in my own little room with my parents buying me, in those days, a 78 RPM record player. I just started to do my own little radio show.
How about that?
And then by the time I was 14, we had a teen hop at the youth center, and we were decorating for the summer party, and they had a disc jockey setup. Coincidentally, built by the guy who was one of the best sound men now in the business. He did the sound for not only the Greek Theater, the Hollywood Bowl, but his Elvis and Neil Diamond among his clients, doing the sound for them. He built this little radio studio you could broadcast to the youth center. I went in there, started clowning around on the microphone, and everybody said, gee, you're pretty good. I'm thinking, well, I've been rehearsing since I was 5. So they said, well, why don't you MC the hop tonight? Be the disc jockey. So I became the disc jockey for the hop that night. After that, the sponsors at the youth center wanted me to do it permanently for the junior high night. About a couple of months later, they said, we want you to do it for senior high night. So at 14, all of a sudden, I had found my groove as a disc jockey. And by 16, my dad got me an audition at the local radio station. It was a standard, don't call us, we'll call you. Well,
sure.
About 6 months later, they did. And the rest is history.
Hey, how about that? I first went on the air in Nebraska when I was 15, growing up in Omaha. I was in junior achievement at the big 50,000 water in Omaha. What is that?
What, WOW? Oh, no, they're the small one. The big one back then?
1110.
KFAB, was
there
it?
You go.
Yeah, KFAB.
I grew up like you, idolizing people on that radio station. Did you ever hear Lyle Bremser do Nebraska football?
Sure.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And so I was in JA there. So 15 years old, they stick me on the air on a 30-minute tape program, and I'm a DJ all of a sudden. I'm telling all my friends at school, listen to me, listen to me.
That's
my
great.
Mom's friends and everything. So that's how that's weird how some of that stuff gets started.
That's fine.
Now, One of the things is that after your years in Nebraska, you began a radio career. If you could talk about those first few years in radio before you came to L.A. I know you touched upon it with the Oklahoma City thing earlier.
It kind of jumped around. Once my buddy, I hired a guy from Minden down the road, and we became kind of aspiring to, there's got to be something more than just Kearney. So we talked about it, and in those days you had to have a first-class radio license, as they called them, and so we decided we would go down to Elkins Radio Institute in Dallas. Went down there, had a 4-week course. On the way back, he stopped in this Wichita, Kansas radio station that we heard while we were punching around. Decided he wanted to try it. He got the job there. 3 months later, I'm back in Kearney. He calls me and said, they got another opening. Come down. So I went down to Wichita, was there for a little over a year, Oklahoma City for a year, Boston a little less than a year. It was one of those find us.
How'd you end up in Boston from Oklahoma City and Wichita?
Larry Lujak, who was later on a legendary super jock, as he called himself in his book, and he was one of the funniest.
WLS Chicago?
Yeah, he heard me on a radio when he was driving through the snow in Wyoming.
How about that?
Got to Boston, they were looking for somebody else. He said, I really like this guy I heard in Oklahoma City, so they recommended me. They flew me out, got the job in Boston, and then in Boston, after only about 6 or 8 months on the air, the guy, Bill Drake, who started everything at KHJ here in Los Angeles, heard me, wanted me for Los Angeles for a station here, KHJ, and they eventually worked out a deal where I got out of my contract, paid it off back there, and wound up at KHJ.
How about that? We're going to get into KHJ here in just a second. Back to the Nebraska thing real quick. Now, you still are a diehard Husker football fan, aren't you?
Indeed. Yeah, I'm a huge supporter. I'm very happy so far with the moves Bill Callahan's making. And
I got to tell you about that real quick. I was kind of disappointed in that Cotton Bowl. I thought it was a winnable game.
Yeah.
I saw some coaching moves made that I wasn't so happy about. He loses 6 his first year, 4 his second year, good Alamo Bowl win, loses 5 this year. I get a feeling if he loses 5 more this year, and the schedule's tough, it really is tough. I don't know if he's going to survive, but I don't know. Maybe you've got a different feeling?
He's a great recruiter. He's one of the top. We had another top 10 class this year of high school. I was disappointed out here with USC. Matter of fact, the Nebraska University paper did an interview with me, and I commented, I said, I don't understand why he didn't let Zach throw more. He was like he was a conference player of the year, and I said, we could have picked apart USC defense early because they weren't that good at that time. Well, as it turned out, I guess he didn't want him to get hurt for the conference schedule of the Big 12, so that was one of the reasons he held him back. This coming season, we've got USC coming into Lincoln.
Yes, we do.
So it's going to be a whole different thing.
But let's not forget, we're still living here in Los Angeles.
I know.
We left back there and came out here. But I will say, USC is going to be awesome again. They could be preseason number 1, and they're going to be tougher. And Nebraska's got a new quarterback coming in. We don't know the status of Marlon Lucky.
Yeah.
He had his overdose thing or whatever he had. I just hope that certainly comes into play. When was the last time, real quick, you went back for a Nebraska game in Lincoln?
Oh, it's been eons. Okay. I never had the time anymore.
Last time I was back was in the year 2000, and they had Eric Crouch at quarterback the year before he won the Heisman. All right. Getting back to the radio thing, then after the Boston and all that, you talked about Bill Drake, you came to Los Angeles, and you were a boss jock on KHJ. Before talking about your days at KHJ, describe briefly here what a boss jock was.
Well, boss was a term they came up here in Los Angeles. Everything was boss Angeles, the boss beaches. Everything was the current hip term of the 60s. So that was what they called us at Boss Radio, the boss jocks, and the boss beat. Everything revolved around that. And at 23 years old, when I landed at KHJ, I was the youngest by about 7 or 8 years. Everybody else was in their 30s at that point, and it was intimidating, but everybody said the first 90 days they weren't so sure. After that, they said, "Oh yeah, the guy's got a career here." So.
Oh yeah, and what about those days at KHJ? Great for you, weren't they?
They were. They phenomenal shares. The radio shares you'll never see again. We had 25% of the audience that listened to KHJ by the surveys in those days. These days you can be number 1 just having 5%. So.
Isn't that amazing? That's really and KHJ. Of course, you got the old air checks that sometimes you hear. If you could give me a touch of an old KHJ, Charlie Tuna,
I don't do that
from
anymore.
1968 or 69.
I don't do that anymore.
Oh my!
No,
I'll tell you, it was
changed.
That was one of the inspirational stations in the country. You were now. This was back about now. What years exactly were you at KHJ?
I started in '67. I was there through '72, and then I left to start K-Rock AM here in town, and then moved over to KKDJ, which eventually we became KISS AM and FM, and I was program director and the morning man there at KISS, and It went on for about another dozen stations along the way.
Oh, my. So after KHJ, you went on to, you said that you went on to K-Rock?
K-Rock AM, yeah. We started K-Rock AM, which eventually became now K-Rock FM. And then I moved over to KKDJ FM, which became now what is now currently KISS FM. And then we had the AM, KISS AM, that we bought, changed the call letters of KKDJ to KISS AM and FM.
Now, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, at K-Rock, did you work with Shadow Stevens over there?
Yeah, Shadow. Well, I worked with Shadow at KHJ. He was our weekend jock.
Okay.
Yeah,
right.
Shadow and I have known each other forever. I just had a chance to visit with him, had him on the show about a half a year ago, and we caught up a little bit on it.
You know, it's interesting. I was thrilled to do this. I interviewed Shadow here earlier this year. By the way, we're taping here on March 20th of 2007 on a Tuesday morning right after Charlie's show. I interviewed Shadow, and he said that he had been on your show a couple of times. You were nice enough to have him on. Now, you hold several very distinctive titles in that you have probably been the morning man on more different L.A. radio stations that I can think of than probably anybody. Now, since the mid-1980s, I think you've been on the morning man on 97.1, KHTZ, K-Hits, also KRLA, KODJ. Those are both oldie stations.
Right.
KMPC, AM Sports. You were also on KLAC, weren't you?
Yep.
Okay.
The morning
and currently, of course, K-Big here in Los Angeles, 104.3. And you're a popular man.
There's about 16, I think, call letters I've worked mornings on. I set in for Ken and Bob over at KBC a few times between stations. There was another couple of stations in there, 10Q, that was with Mike McVeigh, who's now a world-famous consultant in radio. We worked there together, and then I was trying to think if there's one other that you might have left out. Kick FM in Orange County, which is a country station.
Okay, sure.
So yeah, I've done it all, basically.
Hey, you know, one thing, and I was just going to say, one thing that's very unique about you, Charlie, is the wide variety of formats that you have worked. Top 40, adult contemporary, country, oldies, and sports. Man, you can do it all.
Yeah, I've enjoyed every format. People say, what's your favorite kind of music? I said, I like it all. I really do. I would do classical probably if the opportunity came along, but I really do enjoy it.
You know, in 1990, this had to be a great thrill for you, Charlie. You received a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. What a moment it was for you.
I didn't really want it at that point. They had nominated me, or the staff had wanted to nominate me for years back in the 80s, and I just said, you know, it's something I want to be like Jimmy Stewart's age or something. I want to have it as kind of a culmination of my career. So they finally decided they'd go behind my back and nominated me with the Chamber of Commerce. And as Johnny Grant put it that day, he says, what took you so long to come here to get your star, Charlie? And I said, I'm really very, very grateful and appreciative, but I always thought you had to be a lot older than this to get your star. But that happened that way.
In 1997, Charlie, you were chosen one of the top 10 radio personalities in L.A. radio history. How about that?
Kind of scary. It really is.
It is not.
This market has had the best. I think this is the Super Bowl of radio. Right?
I agree with you, sir. I couldn't agree with you more.
New York, I had the opportunity to work there. I also had several offers from Chicago, but I just said, no, L.A. is where everybody comes.
I agree with you. I always have, and you were ranked among the top 10. We're going to talk about some of those great other top 10 announcers here. Get your feelings on them here in just a little bit. Talk about your Armed Forces radio work. What exactly do you do for them?
I stopped that back in '96, actually, when Bill Clinton cut the budget.
Oh, no!
He cut the Armed Forces. I did, though, do 25 years, 6,000 shows of Armed Forces Network shows. And then the Defense Department just sliced and diced everything back in '96, including the Armed Forces radio budget. So a lot of us personalities, they went looking for more generic music and people, and that was the end of that. But I got to say, that was still, to this day, I get emails from people who are stationed around the world in the Armed Forces. And I've had a tremendous amount of feedback from the people who overseas, they were made to feel at home, they said, with all my shows.
Well, I just would like to say, Charlie, I'm very sorry I had to cut that back in 1996. But listen, I had some other issues going on back then. I got in trouble, as you know, and I just had to do something, I guess. I'm sorry that I had to cut you out. I'm just so sorry.
Apology accepted, Bill.
Now, your career, of course, Charlie, goes beyond just radio. You've done voiceover work for TV shows like Scrabble, The Mike Douglas Show. And in the 1980s, you were the voice on Casey Kasem's TV countdown show, not the radio countdown show, but the TV countdown show he had called America's Top 10. How was that experience working with Casey?
Great friends with Casey for all these years, and he's been one of the best. He's just a real, genuine human being, very charitable, involved with all these different things that he gives to. And he's one of those people who is very true to. I've been asked to do several projects for him ever since then, including I set in for him a couple of times on his current America's Top 20 show with the Premier Radio Network. So, yeah, Casey is just one of my treasured people I know.
And I admire Casey. He's probably my all-time broadcast hero. I've met him on several occasions, and Casey Kasem is just an absolutely wonderful man. And now, you've also been in some movies. Which movies?
Just a couple. That was back in the 70s, and when I had more time in my hands, I did a movie called Roller Coaster, which is on DVD to this day, and it was with Timothy Bottoms, George Segal, who I found out in those days was a huge fan, and a matter of fact, at the wrap party, had to rush over and introduce me to his daughter, and then he saw my plate he'd got me up from, and he said, "Are you done?" I said, "Yeah." He finished my plate that night at the wrap party dinner. But George Segal, Richard Widmark, Henry Fonda, those were, and a 13-year-old Helen Hunt.
Hey, how about that?
Played George Segal's daughter. She was in the movie, too. So, Timothy, it was one of those real scary movies we shot at Magic Mountain, and it was quite an experience. Universal, I still get residual checks for a couple of bucks to this day.
Talk about your interview philosophy. You've been doing so many interviews on your shows for so many years. Talk about what are the things that you look for when you do interview?
I look for things that maybe the people haven't been asked about, something. And again, these days, the Internet's very helpful in finding all sorts of tidbits, albeit some of them are not true, and that's what's fun to turn up in the interview also. It's one of those where I don't really look at it as an interview. I like to think of it as a visit, just two people sitting down having a nice little visit, and I think you can find out a lot more about a person that way.
Just like we're doing right here.
Exactly.
Some other items to cover here, Charlie. Wanted to get your opinion. We talked about this earlier on the following radio personalities. Got a bunch of them here. We already talked about Casey Kasem. Your thoughts on Rick Dees?
Rick Dees, he was one of those where I first heard about Rick when Disco Duck hit the airwaves.
76.
He was working in Memphis. I called him. We did an interview on the air, and he's been a big friend and also a good fan ever since, too. He told me even when he moved out of Memphis and then came out here, he would always listen to my show and try and get ideas, and he's done rather well, I would say.
Oh, yes, very much so. How about, now, a totally different side of the spectrum here, Howard Stern?
Howard Stern has got his own audience. I can't belittle him for that. It's not the type of radio that I would do. It's not something that people, I don't think, would be very comfortable listening to me. But Howard Stern is unique in the annals of our business. He will always be remembered as groundbreaking. It turned the whole industry upside down as far as his philosophy and what he does on the air. I really can't take anything away from the man, just to say that he does his kind of radio, I do mine.
Charlie, where do you think radio's headed?
Once it gets to the Internet, I'm not even able to predict what's going to happen then. But once radio gets the Internet in cars and becomes widespread, everybody's going to have their own radio station, it seems like. It's one of those where I don't think satellite radio is a very viable medium, because HD radio, even though it hasn't gotten much traction right now, I think that's going to be something that's big. But the Internet is going to be the master of all the radio domains, I think, eventually. And stations like ourselves and others are going to have to adapt or die, because that's where everybody will be going. And that's where most of them already are.
Now, how will they adapt?
I don't know yet. That's something everybody's trying to figure out. Because you look at the different sites right now. YouTube has become a phenomenon out there. Google is like the biggest thing going when it comes to, I wish I would have bought stock when they first sold it, but I thought, no, it can't be that big. Well, it is, and it's even bigger than any of us expected. So the Internet, that's where radio's headed.
What's the future of radio syndication, national countdown shows and so on?
Major companies like ourselves and maybe some of the others will probably still play a role, but I think it'll be more like the boutique shows, although it's a nice cost-cutting measure on the weekends for most radio people, is they plug in one of these shows, and for the barter situation where the commercials run and it's for free, then that will be probably the most of the time where you'll hear it.
Very, very good. Charlie, I want to thank you for being my guest on my show today. I've always admired you, and I'm so happy that I could meet with you and chat with you.
Thank you.